On Sunday, we saw the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil in the second round of the presidential elections, where he got about 55% of the vote against the candidate of the Workers' Party, Haddad, who received 45% of the vote. This is clearly, there's no two ways about this, it's clearly a setback. A reactionary candidate has been elected. It's a setback for the workers and the poor in Brazil and beyond, throughout the whole region. But we need to understand, first of all, what is the context of this election. The election took place with the main presidential candidate for the PT, for the Workers' Party, Lula, in jail and barred by the Supreme Court from standing in this election. At the time when he was disqualified as a candidate, he was first in the opinion poll. So it's quite clear that there was an intervention of the judiciary, of a branch of the state, in order to prevent the most popular candidate from standing in the election. So you can see that the Brazilian state did help Bolsonaro get elected. On top of this, this was a very polarized campaign. Between the first and the second round, particularly, there were a whole number of incidents, violent incidents, assaults against supporters of the Workers' Party, people being attacked just for wearing an election T-shirt of the left wing. And so this was far from being a normal democratic election campaign. There were also attacks on freedom of expression in more than 20 universities. The military police came on orders from the electoral court to prevent meetings against fascism, to bring down banners that have been put up by the students against fascism and so on. And this obviously had an impact on the election result. Now, many people say Bolsonaro is a fascist, and what we've seen in Brazil on Sunday is the beginning of a fascist dictatorship. Now, this is not true. In my opinion, this is not the case, and we need to maintain a sense of proportion. Bolsonaro is a reactionary politician, a far-right politician, if you want. He's a former army captain, and throughout his political career, he has made clear his political views, which are very outrageous, extreme, and reactionary. He's a homophobe, he's a misogynist, he's a racist. He has made some very inflammatory statements about every single subject. For instance, he says that he's a supporter of torture. He complimented the military dictatorship in Brazil, but criticized it for not having killed more people rather than just torturing them. He says Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, is his model. There's no doubt he is a reactionary politician, but fascism is a particular type of reaction. Fascism is based on the mobilization of armed gangs of the petty bourgeois to physically destroy the organizations of the working class. And fascism came to power in the 1920s and 1930s in a number of European countries on the basis of the failure of the workers' organizations to take power, on the failure of a number of revolutionary opportunities. This is not the case in Brazil. Bolsonaro is not based on armed fascist gangs in the streets. And Bolsonaro has not come to power on the basis of the physical destruction of the organizations of the working class. The trade unions in Brazil continue to exist, and they are very strong. Only a year ago, in 2017, they organized a general strike against the economic measures of the Temer government, and about 40 million workers participated in strikes and mass demonstrations and so on. Political parties continue to be legal, etc. This is not to downplay the danger that Bolsonaro represents. There are in Brazil fascist gangs. They're quite small, but nevertheless they are dangerous. And already one person has been killed in the election campaign by a supporter of Bolsonaro. We will see more of these attacks as Bolsonaro is in power, and these fascist gangs will be emboldened. But what we will see above all, I think, is the use of the state apparatus to repress the social movements. This is not new in Brazil. In fact, the state already used the military police, the courts and the tribunals to attack the social movements for the last few years, particularly after the big movements of the youth in 2013 against the increase in price of public transport, and the protest against the World Cup in 2004 and 2014. The state in Brazil is already very reactionary, and the Brazilian police, for instance in Rio de Janeiro, is known for extrajudicial killings of mainly black youth in the favelas, in the poor neighborhoods. This we will continue to see, and we'll probably see an increase in these actions. But this does not this does not mean exactly the same thing as if we had a fascist dictatorship in Brazil. That will be quite something else. Now, still, we need to understand how come such a reactionary politician, extreme right-wing politician with such outrageous views has come to power and has won an election in a country like Brazil, which is a large country, with an electorate which is composed of over 140 million people. Some people have offered different explanations to this. Some people say, well, he has been very skillful in using the network of the evangelical churches, which have grown in influence and in size in the whole of Latin America in recent times. Other people says that the main reason why he was elected was the use of fake news, false messages spread through WhatsApp networks. And these are obviously contributing factors, but this in reality doesn't explain why he won the election. If you say that propaganda wins an election, then this is also a very defeatist point of view, because the ruling class will always use any means at their disposal, the mass media, the television and social media, to spread the poison, the racism and their political views. So we will never be able to win. In fact, in Brazil, for many years, the ruling class waged a campaign against Lula, the first president elected on the Workers' Party ticket, to say that he was a communist, that he was going to abolish religion, that he was going to unleash class war and so on, and in order to prevent him from being elected. And nevertheless, he won the election in 2002 with 61% of the vote. So obviously, bourgeois propaganda has an impact on an election, but it's not an absolute question. In fact, if we want to understand why there's been such a discrediting of all political parties and institutions in Brazil, which has allowed an extreme right-wing candidate to win, we need to go back to the track record of the governments of the PT, which has been in power in Brazil between 2002 and 2016. The PT is known as the Workers' Party. It was created during the struggle against the dictatorship as a political representation, the political voice of the working class. And at the beginning, it had a very radical program, a socialist program, you could say. But as it came closer to power, it progressively moderated this program. And by the time it was elected to the presidency under Lula in 2002, Lula had already accepted the capitalist system, had abandoned the socialist principles of the party, and carried out the policy within the limits of the capitalist system. In fact, the first reform of the pension system, counter-reform of the pension system, was implemented by Lula. But the difference was that Lula presided over a long period of economic growth. So, in fact, most workers benefited from that period. There were wage increases above inflation. The working class was enormously strengthened. And many people remember those years, even though he carried out a number of counter-reforms, as a positive thing. These were years of economic growth and general advancement in living standards. When Dilma was elected, in 2010, the situation already started to change. Brazil had entered into an economic crisis, And when she was re-elected in 2014, that was like the last chance that the workers gave Dilma to come to power and transform the situation. Dilma stood in the second round against the right-wing candidate, and she accused the right-wing candidate of wanting to privatize, of wanting to cut the social spending and generally implement policies of austerity. But when she was elected by a narrow majority in the second round, then she immediately proceeded to implement precisely those policies of austerity, cuts in public spending, repression against the social movements. And we also have to remember that both governments, the governments of Lula and the government of Dilma, were governments of an alliance with the bourgeois parties. Key bourgeois parties were part of that government. In the case of Dilma, for instance, she appointed the head of the Association of Cattle Ranchers and Landowners as the Minister of Agriculture, and she appointed an IMF banker as the Minister of Finance. And so that gives you an idea of the kind of policies that government followed. And so when the crisis hit Brazil very hard in 2014, 2016, this was the government that was in power carrying out austerity policies. So when people started protesting, mainly youth, against this government, they were protesting against the establishment, and the establishment was the PT. And many workers who had voted for the Workers' Party for all their lives, who had secured PT governments for over a decade, were now sick and tired of this, and the links between the Workers' Party and the organized working class started to break down. It was at this point when the popularity of Dilma was at an historical record low of only 8%, that then a section of the ruling class decided to move against her. The ruling class uses left-wing governments to carry out austerity policies. When these governments are discredited, then they throw them out, they throw them away. And in this case, they used a constitutional parliamentary maneuver, the impeachment, in order to remove Dilma from power in 2016. There were also a number of corruption cases affecting not only the PT, but all parties. But obviously the PT, having been the party in power for the longest period of time, was the party that had probably more people involved in these corruption scandals. This led to a general discrediting of all political parties. Temer, who is a right-wing bourgeois politician who had been in a coalition with Dilma, he was Dilma's vice president, then came to power and immediately attempted to implement even more austerity measures, more privatizations. He was met by fierce resistance on the part of the working class. There was a general strike, as I said, in 2017. But it is in this context that we need to understand why the PT was unable to defeat the far-right candidate. People were sick and tired of broken promises. The confidence of the workers in this party to transform society had been broken and discredited, and this is what set the ground for the election finally of Bolsonaro on Sunday. What will happen next? Well, obviously the capitalists are very happy, they're very pleased. The stock exchange has gone up in Brazil, and they're basically cheering Bolsonaro because Bolsonaro has promised to carry out austerity policies, brutal austerity policies, including the privatization of all state-owned companies and brutal counter-reform of the pension system. In my opinion, once these economic policies start to be implemented, there will be fierce resistance on the part of the working class. The workers in Brazil have not been defeated, the forces are intact, and they will move to resist such policies from being implemented, in the same way that we have seen that after the election of the Macri government in Argentina in 2015, we have seen already 4 general strikes and increased militancy of the working class against this right-wing government. It will be a period of polarization to the right, as we've seen in the election of Bolsonaro, polarization to the left as well in the form of working class struggle. And already we see the students at the forefront of such resistance against the policies of the reactionary policies of the Bolsonaro government. Finally, I think that there are some general conclusions that we need to draw from this experience in Brazil, from the election of a far-right president. The first one is that if you have a left-wing government, a government of a party that's linked to the labor movement, that comes to power promising change and finally implements policies of austerity, policies within the limits of the crisis of capitalism, this government will be discredited, and the failure of this government will open the way for the right wing to come to power. And the second lesson I think we need to learn, which is also important, is that you cannot fight the policies of the far right by presenting yourself as the establishment. Haddad said we need to unite all Democrats against fascism. But for many people, democracy meant corruption, high levels of unemployment. And when he talked about uniting all Democrats, he was talking about uniting the Workers' Party with the bourgeois politicians, which had just removed Dilma from power and were thoroughly discredited. On this basis, you cannot fight the far right. You need to fight. The only way that you can fight against the far right is by presenting an alternative, not by presenting oneself as being the status quo, the establishment. We need to fight against the establishment, but from the left. i.e. we need to fight against capitalism with bold socialist policies, with policies of renationalization, with policies of free education, free housing, free healthcare, which are increasingly popular. That is, we need to offer a perspective of socialist transformation. In Brazil, we need to keep our heads cool. We need to understand fundamentally the reasons why this has happened as the premise for restarting the struggle, continuing the struggle, the resistance against this against this far-right government, and rebuilding a workers' movement on the basis of a socialist program, a clear anti-capitalist program, a program based on the defense of the interest of the working class.